Hi everyone, and welcome back to In Substantia. I'm Gabor Farkas. Today's conversation takes us into the heart of an initiative that's quietly reshaping how finance engages with the world's most pressing challenges. My guest is Karen Hitschke, CEO of Building Bridges, a Geneva-based platform that has grown well beyond the boundaries of a conference. It now acts as a meeting ground for finance, development, government, and civil society. If you're not yet familiar with it, think of Building Bridges as both a stage and a structure, a place where unlikely coalitions form and where the goal is not short-term gain, but long-term systemic change. But we don't begin with systems. In this episode, we explore how her leadership has evolved across sectors and worldviews, what it takes to convene diverse actors around shared goals, and why Building Bridges refuses to become just another annual talking shop. So whether you're interested in finance, development, system change, or simply how ideas move when humans connect, I invite you to stay with us. Let's get into it. Before we talk about institutions and systems, I'd like to begin with you as a person. Most people involved in shaping major initiatives tend to draw from deeply personal origins, values, places, or stories that guide them long before the job title appears. Can you take us back to your early years? Was there something or someone that helped shape your worldview or sense of purpose?
Yes, for sure. Thank you. Thank you, first of all, for having me, Gabor. Really a pleasure to be here. And I can probably go back to very early childhood, but there are a few things that really, I think, formed me, or also just something that appeared very early on. I think on one hand, I've always been really, really interested in agriculture and gardening and how to be autonomous in a way. So the whole question about, how do you feed yourself was something that intrigued me. For some reason, I don't know, I just liked that idea. I always want to have my own big garden or mini farm where I could basically then grow my own vegetables. That was kind of a childhood dream. But I think what formed me on one hand, on the social side, in fact, and that's connected. When I was in my adolescence, basically there was this huge famine in Ethiopia. And I think that connection also with agriculture, some of that my interest, was something that triggered me to study biology. I wanted to study biology in order to develop drought-resistant crops so that basically you wouldn't have any more famines. And I think it was really something that was very deep. And there's a question about how can you really develop something that will solve an issue like that on a sustainable way. I was not that much into politics at that stage. So the whole question about what related crisis led to that was a totally different story. But that's something that really drove my decision. And I think there's a second element I was thinking about that when that really formed me. I grew up during the Cold War. So and I grew up with a divided Germany, very close to the border. So, and we had to cross to Berlin, which was, an enclave basically, or exclave from the Western German point of view. And I remember very well, also again in my adolescence, we went there was a wall, it was the same country, but it was divided. And I grew up with it, it seemed cemented. And suddenly then when I was 22 or 21, the wall came down. The Cold War ended within a very short time. And I think it did drive a belief also in me that things can change in a really surprising way, in a positive way. Things you had never, that seemed to be stable, that seemed to be cemented and would never change. You couldn't imagine it changing. It came overnight. It felt like coming overnight. And that is also something where I draw a belief to say you can change things, and not everything is just set the way it is and it appears. And movements can take a real influence and can really move things at scale if a lot of people pull in the same direction. And I think that's an optimism that I still keep, and it's a good reminder.
Education is often framed as linear path, but for many leaders, it involves powerful detours or awakenings. What were the key moments or turning points in your youth or education that profoundly altered how you saw your role in the world?
I wouldn't too much go into early education. I mean, I've described a little bit what formed me. What I found out when I studied biology, that although I was really intrigued with the topic and the purpose why I was doing it, that shifted over time. I found out I was not a researcher because you need a certain, attitude. And I really like the big picture, the movement, connecting the dots. But being a researcher, doing very deep on very granular things was something that didn't intrigue me then over time. So I decided, basically, I was forced to get out of it in a way. I finished my master's degree or my diploma, and then moved into consulting. And that was quite a culture shock for me. I can promise you I had no clue about business. I grew up in a very sheltered academic environment. My father was a teacher, and none of us understood anything about business. And the shock from being a researcher in a lab to moving into McKinsey, fast-paced, very different environment, completely, in a way, also unexpected for me, was a little bit painful at times, but very challenging. And it did raise my curiosity. And I think it opened my mind to say, wow, there are things that are really interesting, which I never knew about. They were not on my radar. But if you push yourself, you can learn things. And once you get involved with them, they become much more interesting than you ever thought. So basically, it was a first step for me to take away a hurdle or say, wow, I don't know about this. I don't want to know about it. Rather the other way around, it really created a curiosity, or basically it targeted my curiosity to say, well, there's a completely different world. And I think that's something that has shaped me in a way to say, well, in fact, I dare to jump on things that I don't know necessarily because I've seen I can do it. I've done it before. It was a bit of a struggle once in a while, but I learned so much and it opened so many new opportunities. And I think you just have to be a little bit of a daredevil to push boundaries and to push yourself. And the reward is immense.
We are all shaped by the company we keep and also by the ideas we let in. For some, it's literature. For others, it's direct experience or political events. So you mentioned the wall coming down. That was a major political event. Who were thinkers, mentors, or movements that most impacted you and the path you've taken?
People who inspired me: Nelson Mandela, Mahatma Gandhi, people who persevered long-term in difficult times, but in a peaceful way. And I think just by keeping standing up and staying on track and really living up to your own beliefs was something that at the end resulted in the change they were looking for. And it did inspire a lot of other people to follow. It did disrupt a status quo, and it didn't come overnight. But for me, it's very inspiring to be able to do that in a peaceful way, but by having the conviction, by inspiring other people and really staying on track to something that you think is right. And that has, I think, shaped myself. And I would not compare myself at all, obviously, with a Mandela or Gandhi. But just if you think about it, and we see that today in today's time, I think it's really important to understand what you think is right and what your values are, and to stick with them and not to just shift them overnight because other people might think they are inconvenient or not the, fashion of the day or whatever. And that is something. And more recently, I've been working a lot with Professor Yunus, who I worked with when I was co-founding an impact investment organization, one of the pioneers in that field, Yunus Social Business. And there was a time when impact investing didn't really exist yet. And that exchange also with a leader like Professor Yunus, who believes in, how to combine business or how to make business purposeful for society and not the other way around. So business really serving society, and how he believes in certain values that I share a lot with him, and how you don't buckle under resistance, but just keep course in a very quiet, very humble way. I think I find that very inspiring, and it shows that things can move and things are moving. And I think, again, he has shown it, other people have shown it. That's a big inspiration for me.
Where can we read about him?
I think so. One of the books he wrote, I think the most recent one maybe, is A World of Three Zeros. So that is something that definitely kind of summarizes a lot his journey. And then, of course, you can read about the Grenian Bank. He's the inventor of microfinance. So there's a lot to read about him. And then recently in all articles, because at the moment he's the interim prime minister of Bangladesh. So he has an important role at the moment that he's playing there. That's not how I knew him.
Leadership isn't static. It evolves with responsibility, setbacks, and time. What felt true in one era can feel limiting in another. How has your understanding of leadership changed over the years, and what do you now see as its most essential qualities?
I think what is really important as a leader is that you walk the talk. So you need that credibility, that, let's say, integrity as a leader to say what you say is what you do. I think that is really important for people to follow you. To have a trust-based relationship and also be honest about things you can or you cannot do in a way. So trying to manage expectations, it's really important for a team, not to overpromise. I think that's something, and I mentioned standing up for what you think is right. The conviction, again, that's walking the talk. So just because somebody says we should do it differently, you can think about doesn't mean you don't take on feedback. And I think listening is an important element of leadership, also to be open to new ideas, because you can't know it all yourself. I do think it's really important to stay with your convictions if you really believe it's right. So listening openly to other ideas is important, but it doesn't mean you have to incorporate everything, but you really need to make your own choices. And that's something that I have come over time. I think it also comes with confidence. So if I would say how my leadership style has changed, I think I was probably more, when I was young, I was probably doing more my own thing, listening less to other people and not showing if I had made wrong, or if I felt I had made the wrong decisions. Now, basically, I can say can be more vulnerable. I can say, well, I made a mistake there. I'm okay with that. I can also show to other people that it's okay to make a mistake. The expectation to say you always have to be perfect, you always have to get everything right is completely unrealistic. But it's certainly a picture that you project to the outside world as a leader in various positions. As I mentioned, I started my career at McKinsey as a biologist. I really didn't know what I was doing, to be honest, those first few weeks. But I was trying to project, of course, this. I know what I'm doing. But it's very hard to basically put up a mask and you live with a mask for a long time because pretend you're doing something that you are not. And although there's a truth to say fake it till you make it, and I think there's also an element of that, it's also okay to sometimes say, you know what, I just don't know that yet. And people don't expect you to know it because they know you're new in that field. They know they've hired you as somebody who has no clue about business. So I think it also helps putting yourself under less pressure than necessary. And I think that's really a big learning that I've come to learn over time. I'm still not perfect at that, so I can still improve once in a while with that self-reflection, I think. But it does help.
Before Building Bridges became a platform for aligning finance with sustainable development, you had already worked across multiple sectors, from health innovation to impact investing and strategic philanthropy. This kind of cross-disciplinary experience is rare, but essential for systems-level work. What are some of the most formative professional chapters in your journey, and how did they shape the way you now think about change and collaboration?
I would say every position I had has had a strong influence on my understanding of the world now and how I interact, because they've been so very different. So I explained already a little bit McKinsey and how that had obviously influence, just also giving me the courage to say, yes, you can do something completely new and it does work. I worked for 10 years in venture capital. In venture capital, I would say it really got me involved with the whole question of startup environment, about testing ideas, iterating ideas. Failure was normal. So if you look into venture capital, a lot of these companies fail and not because they are bad or somebody didn't try hard enough, but maybe the competition was too big or the timing was wrong. And that's an important learning, to say things fail. It's important also to move on, to not be static, to kind of keep iterating, to adapt with the market, to take feedback in and then make it better, without throwing everything out of the window. So finding that balance is something that I really like in startup environments or also in young organizations. And it's something that I really learned there. And then, of course, I went through the crisis of 2000, or not just me, the whole industry, when the financial market then broke completely with the internet bubble. And then you also learn that sometimes you just can't influence things. It's an environment where it's impossible for many internet companies to survive. And 20 years later, those business models made it. 20 years earlier, they were not ready. The market wasn't ready for it. So I think that's a good learning. And the other learning is that cash is king. That's something my professor always told us at business school. I found that, and it was a theoretical concept until I saw that cash was king, because if you run out of cash, then you go bankrupt. That was a hard learning, but it was, I think that really was quite insightful. And I like the iteration. So I always stuck with with starting up things with that very flexible environment. It creates a lot of ambiguity as well. So it can be quite stressful. But it is something that I really appreciate because it gets you a lot of the flexibility in mindset and openness that I really like. So I think that's one thing. So that was my whole venture capital idea. I had a 5-year stint, which was not professional, when I lived in Japan with my family. We have 2 children and they were quite small at the time. So I was taking some time out. And I would say that was a different shift or basically different learning for me. One, not working for a while was something that was new to me. But the other thing is when you move out of Europe and suddenly your center is Japan, you see the world from a different viewpoint, from a different angle. You think Europe is the center. You look at a map and Europe is always in the center when you grow up in Europe. You move to Japan and suddenly Japan is in the center of the world because this is how the maps are designed there. And of course, then the culture is different. Being exposed, or politics is different. China is in front of the door. North Korea is suddenly in front of the door. It's not a far away thing, but it's very close. And that was something very, very interesting. I had a very international environment. I also learned Japanese, so really got immersed in a very different culture. That was an eye-opener for me, and also an appreciation how a society can be very, very different. And by the way, it was also the first time I was a very obvious foreigner in another country. I was in France, I was in Israel before that, I was in the UK. You kind of fade in because you don't look that different. You're in Japan, you always stand out. So there's no hiding. And I think it was also an interesting experience to say, well, in fact, you're standing out, you're always different. And that is psychologically not always easy. And something that also stayed with me, appreciating how other people might feel if they're in a similar situation in Europe, for example. So I think that's culturally was important for me when I went through that experience in a way. Was a good base for my move to social business. So when I came back,
I was reflecting because my son spent a year as a foreign exchange student in Japan, and I traveled around Japan. We went as a family and I stayed 3 weeks longer and I traveled around. And I'm remembering my experience and my exposure to culture, and Asian culture is very different. And in a conversation that I had last year with Sandy Chong, who's from Singapore, I was reminded that we Europeans, Occidentals with the US, and we see ourselves at the center of the world, but we are only 18% of the population of the planet. So Judeo-Christian values are very marginal in comparison to other ways of looking at the world. And we should take that into account more, and politicians and those who work on changing the world have to take that into account, because there are other paths that are also possible. Yeah. And I think that building bridges takes that into account.
Yeah. And I think it's quite right what you say. I think it was the first exposure for me that was so fundamentally different from what I was used to. And it really opened, in a way, new opportunities, but also different recognition. So when I came back from Japan, I was in fact, rethinking. There was a bit of a gap because I didn't have a job at that time, but I wanted to go back to work. It was a great opportunity because it did allow me to take a step back from that, more outside perspective, and then say, well, what do you want to do with your life next? Because in any case, I wasn't jumping into something right away. I didn't have to. So I was thinking, should I go back to venture capital or to something related, biotech, healthcare, what I was doing before? And then, in fact, I went back to my original thinking to say, well, you did want to save the world, do quotation marks, because you never saved the world, of course. But I had started my career with a social, mission or inclination. So I was thinking how I could use my skills from venture capital with a combination of more, let's say, social impact or something. That was in 2011. So that was quite early on. So this whole question about notion of social entrepreneurship was just coming up, but it wasn't that common yet. And then I really started researching and mobilizing my network and understanding what was happening, where I could do that. And happened, in fact, through that network, come across a team that was just about to start Unisocial Business. And I joined that team as a co-founder, and we built up Unisocial Business to think about how can you systematically, like in venture capital, support, finance, and grow social businesses. So basically business which have the economic sustainability, so basically work as a business, but they do have a social purpose. There was a concept of Professor Yunus, and the idea was how can we take that out into the world and in different countries. And that was a very interesting journey, because we were working in countries like, we started out as a startup ourselves. We started with Haiti. We went to Albania, Tunisia, then some of the larger countries. Now the organization is in 4 regions in East Africa, in Latin America, and in India, basically, and a few more countries. But it was a really interesting experience. And it was one of the things where, again, you're pioneering a complete field. There were not a lot of people in impact investing yet at that stage, so it was novel. The ecosystem wasn't there, wasn't very supportive yet. So we had to establish a lot of things ourselves. But it was really not just rewarding, but it was something where you could feel you were moving things on the ground. And one thing that I learned during that time, I learned a lot of things, including failing and having to close down things and starting others and really learning from mistakes. But one thing I learned that struck me is the appreciation, how if I, as an investor, want to do an investment into social business in Uganda, for example, how it's impossible for me to judge how good that is, that idea, how much I have to rely on a strong local team and so an entrepreneur who really understands the market and the people and how things are being done there in order to be successful. And the longer I did that job, we grew that. I was part of that team for 10 years. Before then, I moved to the board and out of operations. The longer I was there, the less I was convinced that I was the right person in that place, in a way. But it was really important to give the power and the decision power and all the insight really to a team that was on the ground and that really, and was from there and had grown up, had been socialized there and really understood well enough the culture and how things are being done, how business is being done, how customers behave, and so on. And again, I think that journey started a little bit with Japan, but then was really also continuing to say that diversity in terms of how things are being done, how cultures are forming decisions and how to do business. It's so different that we cannot assume that we know it, but we really need to partner. We need to collaborate with the right partners and stakeholders to get to the best outcome. And that reflects really on building bridges, what we're doing. I think it's like, that's exactly that combination. You say you need a nonprofit approach, you need a for-profit approach, you need the local culture, and local sounds like, that's again my perspective here now, sitting here in Geneva, but it's like you need the relevant culture and understanding wherever you're active to come to better outcomes.
Building Bridges is now seen as a flagship event linking finance, sustainability, and multilateral cooperation. But most listeners may not realize that it grew out of very specific conversations and needs right here in Geneva. Bringing together actors from finance, development, policy, and civil society isn't easy. How did the idea for Building Bridges first take shape? And what was the original ambition behind it?
I was not there when it was created. So that was in 2019. I'm going to talk about it more from an outside view, but to say I know what happened, but I was not really the driver behind it at that stage. there were a lot of initiatives happening, in fact, at the same time. And the recognition, to say the SDGs had been there for 4 years. There was not enough movement. It was always thought that private capital would move in much more quickly. And then here in Geneva, you have this very unique environment where there's a strong financial center in Geneva and Switzerland on one hand. You have powerful trading companies, so very, very strong in international trade. And then you have all these international organizations and NGOs. The United Nations, the WHO, the WTO, you have the International Red Cross here. So you have a very different ecosystem, and these two sides don't speak with each other. So there was this increasing recognition. We are in the same city, and we are basically working in different silos. And that's, of course, just representative of the world in a way where the for-profit sector and the non-profit sector are not really good in collaborating with each other. And they work with very different philosophies. They just work very, very differently in terms of mindset, in terms of how they think about, how to tackle things. And from that recognition, there was the United Nations basically reached out also to the financial sector and to the government and said, can we do something together? We have a conference coming up. Could we bring in more private sector people around that so that we can make that connection? And the first pilot it started the discussions in 2018. And then in 2019, there was basically that conference was then used to bring in more private sector. It was about 1,000 people, and it was hugely successful because people really, it was one of the first times that there was this openness to say, oh, let's just listen to each other. Let's just try to understand how the other side works. And that, I would say that opening of mind did shift, maybe not overnight things, but in generally opened the recognition that to say, well, we need to do that more regularly. And then, of course, COVID hit. So there was a big gap. So 1 year, nothing happened. So 2020, it was planned to do something that didn't happen. And then in 21, the conference continued in a very different, again, was still COVID. So it was a bit of a different setup. It was events basically over a few days, but across Geneva, smaller scale events. Again, that was also driven by COVID. But the dynamic was there. But then from then on, it was clear we want to continue that on a more ongoing basis. And then something which was much closer to the current format of building bridges, the conference, so the flagship conference was developed. So from 2022 onwards, it happened at the CICG. It was over several days. And it really is a combination of, on one hand, a top-down program where basically you take trends that are happening at the moment in the world, you bring in keynote speakers, interesting panel speakers, and curate let's say, a top-down program. But then the other thing that always stayed with it is this grassroots movement, in a way, to say you have all these different events. So when we have those still at the conference where we say the community is proposing events that we should be doing, or they want to do, and we basically we are the host, Building Bridges, the conference is a platform, the host, build these different events from the community to happen, now consolidated all at the same place as the CICG. So it's not just a conference, and I think you mentioned that at the beginning. It's a platform. It's a community-driven platform where we really leverage the knowledge and the work that is being done by the community, the collaborations that are being developed, and we connect the dots. We help making those connections. We provide the platform to move forward initiatives. But we don't need to execute that ourselves, so that we provide that space where people can really talk openly and honestly, and considering that they are coming from different worlds and they have that openness to listen to other people who are really having different thoughts, think about the world differently, have been socialized differently, and get a mutual understanding what drives your motivation, basically.
As Building Bridges has grown, so has its complexity. It's not just an event, it's a platform for engagement, experimentation, and long-term coordination. Yet, for an initiative like this, defining success can be tricky. How has Building Bridges evolved since its first edition in terms of format, ambition, or the kinds of conversations it hosts?
I think there are different elements to that. So one is, if you look at the format, I described a little bit how it started and that grassroots movement was then kind of channeled into a format. But one thing that has also been happening relatively recently was that the conference has been basically transformed into a foundation, or basically a foundation has been established to take on the conference, but also to allow us to do more ongoing work. One of the shortcomings, of course, of a conference to say it happens for 3 days and then everybody goes home and everybody continues with their work, but that platform suddenly doesn't exist anymore. It just comes back after a year. What we have started now as part of the foundation is really to say, how can we provide a container platform for ongoing initiatives as a foundation? That means in a small scale, not just a big conference, but how do we take out connections that have been done, initiatives that have been created, or basically which have been seeded, and provide an ongoing platform for that ongoing exchange. And that could be very well be also in closed-door sessions. It can be like bringing 10, 15, 20 people together around a table who come from these different stakeholder groups, nonprofit, for-profit, the government, and who need to sit around the table to really find a solution. So we help identifying these groups who is missing around the table, and then provide a neutral platform for people to come together, to have an open exchange on issues, on hurdles, and really think about how what one needs to improve, what one needs to change in collaboration to move forward to more successfully. And just to give 2 examples, so what we did last year, for example, we assembled one closed-door session on the regulatory side, basically allowing an exchange, like a consultation between different CSOs and CFOs from corporate companies here in Switzerland with the regulatory side to really have an open conversation to say, what does a regulator want to achieve with certain legislation? On the other hand, what does it mean for a corporate to implement that? What are the pain points? And therefore, to achieve the same goal, how could it be adapted without losing out on the goal? And that's important. The goal is always to say, how can we move more private investment towards sustainability? That's the North Star. We would stay on that North Star, but how to get there can be very different. And it's important to have the collaboration, to have that exchange, to say everybody pulls in the same direction to get there. So that's how the format is changing or adapting or being complemented, I would say. Another example, what we also did is we created a small conference with a similar mindset, but smaller scale in Kenya last year. So we took a delegation down there, enabled the same connections with maybe 100, 150 people on the ground, with, again, bridging this United Nations system with the startup environment, with more established corporates, with the financial sector, with development banks on the ground. And there was a similar exchange. And what was interesting was that in Kenya, although people live together in the same city, it was the same experience like here in Geneva. The different sectors had never met before. So by us basically transporting that same concept in a way at a small scale into Kenya allowed the community there to make the same connections, the same bonds that we are trying to foster here in Geneva. And we are continuing that work with an exchange in Africa. We're using, obviously, there are a lot of conferences there, so we're rather working with different platforms there to enable that kind of exchange across geographies between Africa, Kenya, and Switzerland, but also within the African community to foster some of these bridges.
What does impact look like to you in this context? How do you assess whether the initiative is achieving it?
The impact is, in a way, it's direct and indirect. And of course, because we work through the community and we are not necessarily then implementing things, the impact that counts for us is the one that the community is achieving, but we can't attribute everything to building bridges. So we can only support part of that. But if you think about what impact we create, is really the connections we make between very different stakeholders and to see what initiatives are coming out of that. There's one specific example is CFI, so the SDG Innovative Financing Initiative. Sorry, I think this is the wrong description. I will have to look that up. But CFI is the SDG Financing Lab. It's an initiative that was, in fact, evolved out of one of the earlier Building Bridges conference that is supported by the Swiss government, the Luxembourg government, and now most recently by the South Korean government as well. And it's a blended finance vehicle or a fund that allows funds in developing countries to get a first loss tranche, basically to have a seed funding with which then they can basically go out to private investors to get more funding in there. So it's basically de-risking local initiatives. That is a great example of collaboration where you say you have the public sector, you have the private sector that need to work together. We brought that consultation in a way together to say the concept needed to be developed. What does the private sector need in order to support such initiatives? The need was identified, and then basically you got SECO and the other governments basically together in order to provide that facility, set up a team around that. That is a collaboration across different stakeholders, these different sectors and different governments that really came out of building bridges and then was seated there, but now it's its independent organization. And we are supporting it, their partners, they come to building bridges every year, but we don't run it. So this is something where I'd say we're facilitating it, but we are not the ones who basically did it. But that kind of connection, that's a very concrete impact that we did. We're also the platform where TNFD was launched in Europe. That basically enabled...
Can you repeat that?
TNFD. It's a task force for non-financial nature-related disclosures. So it's basically what kind of reporting guidelines do you have if, as a financial investor, you want to, or as a corporate, you want to report on nature, how you impact nature with your activities, how nature is basically impacted in your portfolio. A similar concept exists for climate. That's with TCFD. So that is, it's basically the framework and how you think about, really reporting on the non-financial side, so really on the impact side. And that's an important platform because it allows basically accountability to say people then become conscious to say, what is my impact on nature? And providing a platform with 2,500 people of experts, of decision makers to present that initiative has a ripple effect. So it's not direct in the sense to say we own it, we have it, but by giving a platform to really expose it to really relevant people and players has accelerated the adoption of that framework. And it's now widely recognized. It's taken into ISSB, which is one of the standard setting organizations. And that is an important impact where we can facilitate the uptake and accelerate that uptake that will lead to the fact that more money will flow into that direction because you can now measure and account for the impact. So those are initiatives that we can either initiate because we bring them together and there's a need, like with CFU, there's a need identified and then it takes on shape. But we can also take existing initiatives and provide a platform and the exposure to relevant people to make sure it's adopted much more quickly. And that is something we also intend to do more to say in relevant initiatives, how can we better create those bridges to make sure they are really adopted widely?
Let me just go off script for a tiny bit. Does the name Ernesto Siroli ring a bell?
No.
A few years ago, I watched a TED Talk. It was his TED Talk, and he was talking about his experience as a humanitarian in Africa and how of goodwill they started a big project in Zambia and how it went horribly wrong. The name of the TED Talk is Want to Help Someone? Shut Up and Listen. I shared that TED Talk with my son because before graduating, he was we had been to Zanzibar and he wanted to do something because there are no streetlights and at night the traffic is very dangerous for the kids. And I said, well, before deciding what they need, maybe you should ask them. And this, I mean, I recommend to you and to everybody who's listening that TED Talk, because it's really very interesting how he came to the realization that you cannot just decide here what people need there. You have to go and speak with them.
And I fully agree. I mean, it's a matter of, the country where you are, what the needs are different, the structures are different, decision making is different. But it's also the same if you talk about different stakeholders. If you try to, as a financial sector, to think about how to create impact, or the other side, what's happening now, to say you have international organizations say, oh, now we don't get enough support anymore from USAID and other, development agencies. The private sector needs to come in. Now, the private sector is not just going to come in and replace it, because they have a very different way on how they work. So you need to rethink more like, how do you bring the private sector in? But you're not going to bring them in by doing philanthropy. That's not going to work. But if you think about how to bring them in as investment, you need to rethink how you are creating your impact. I mean, one example that's probably also off script, but I'd love that's very close to my heart, is the whole healthcare sector. So if you think about the healthcare sector, you think about Switzerland, there's insurances, you have basically the hospitals, you have doctors, they are usually private, some of them are public, but a lot of them are private. They treat the patient, they are paid by the patient through the insurance, basically. So so you have a market for that service. Now, if you go to a lot of the developing countries, and not all of them, most of them don't have a public insurance. So there's no mandatory insurance system. And a lot of them don't even offer the ability for people to enter into health insurance, not even a private market. So a lot of countries where health insurance is not being offered. That means if you want to be treated as a patient, you need to pay out of your pocket. But that limits who can pay for it. So the market demand is much, much smaller, because a lot of people just won't get treated or can't pay for it, and so on. So if you rethink on how healthcare is being delivered, you need to rethink the system. You need to say it's not just about giving everything free for philanthropy, because there are people or there are systems where you could really create a private market and have a private market delivering those services. You don't need to pay for everything by development aid. There are people who can pay for it, but you need to kind of create that ecosystem, for example, with an insurance system or something, so that there is a market where then private investment can flow. And you see that happening in middle income countries. You see that especially in Asia, where private investment, professional investment is going into the healthcare sector, and not just for the top rich people, but for the middle class, which is very wide, because there is a market where money can flow in, and you don't have to pay for that for philanthropy. So I think it's also being smart about where you'd really deploy philanthropy, where it's really needed and support, and where you can crowd in the private sector much more and real investments. And I think this is kind of rethinking we need. That's where people need to come together and rethink, but more systems change level, and not in their corner to say, no, if I want to deliver healthcare, it needs to be for non-profit, because this is how healthcare has always been delivered. Not true. You need to really think smartly about what do you deploy where, and how you put the pieces of a puzzle together.
Can you share an example of project, collaboration, or shift in thinking that you believe was directly catalyzed by building bridges?
One shift in thinking I just explained, I think CFI is a very good example of that, because that really created not just an initiative, but concrete money resources that are flowing now into investments, and that help accelerate private investment. Very concretely, I know that from the trip in Africa that we did last year, from that conference, there were connections made between investee company, or let's say a company that was looking for money, and an investor who was interested in basically investing in Africa. And that connection has yielded now a concrete investment. So I think that's a concrete result. But I also want to stress, we are not brokers. So it's not that we are not saying, here's the investee company. We are not pitching companies to say, here's the money.
Yes.
We think more systemically. And so we think more in structures, how we can really think larger scale to replicate that.
Many international events struggle to move beyond declarations and annual headlines. And one of the unique features of building bridges is its effort to track and sustain momentum across years. Listeners might wonder how a forum like this resists the tendency to start over each time. How are the annual themes for building bridges selected?
That really is very dependent in a positive sense. It relies on our governance structure and how we started existing. So if you look at how Building Bridges was created from the beginning, the committee, or let's say the organizations, what we call our founding partners, are coming from all these different stakeholder groups in a way. If you look, and this is translated also into the governance of our foundation. So we have representations from all the different sides. We have representation from the private sector. The SBA, the Swiss Banking Association, is one of our founding partners. AMAS, the Asset Management Association Switzerland. We have the SFG, SSF, which are basically the sustainability finance organizations in Switzerland, also here in Geneva. So the financial sector is part of that consortium, let's say. We have the public sector with the Confederation, with the Canton of Geneva, with the City of Geneva, who are also part of our DNA and our governance. And then we have the international organizations. The United Nations, UNEP-FI is one of our co-founders. We have Centers for Financial Centers for Sustainability is in our network. International NGOs like the WWF, IISD, Peace Nexus, they are all part of our DNA. They are our founding partners. And now going back to how the program is put together, we are consulting with them. So basically, when we start at the beginning of the year, so usually 8 months before the conference already, we work with them with a committee which consists of all these different stakeholders to say, what are the themes coming up? So we do our own research, our team, but then we play it back with the committee and say, okay, what do you see coming up? Because they are all these different stakeholders. They have the radar out. So it's basically that community who helps us define what is core this year. And we keep doing that all the time. They're also the ones who help us solicit the right speakers. So we make sure we have relevant speakers and we have a diversity also in the speaker group. And that diversity is a geographic one, it's a stakeholder one, people with different experience. And depending on the theme, of course, it is important to really have the key leaders from that field represented at Building Bridges, at the summit, but also high-level plenaries.
What mechanisms do you have to ensure continuity or follow through year after year?
But the continuity is, in fact, in that governance. These people are basically there all the time. And they, as a community, they do ongoing work. So an SBA is going to do their own work. They basically take out things from the conference and will continue working on them. And maybe also another element that is similarly important is, I said, we are a community. Those people are our founding partners. But if you look at who's coming, we have 2,500 participants every year who are coming. They represent organizations from these different stakeholder groups. NGOs, development banks, the government, they keep doing the work throughout the year. And we have a mechanism which allows these co-created events taking place, the action events. And they come back after a year and they say, this is what we've been doing throughout the year. We would like to present and show at Building Bridges at the next conference what work has been done. So we have that community in the participation, which then is, of course, also complemented with new people coming in, new organizations coming in from that network, from those collaborations. So it's basically the continuity comes through our community that continues, all these individual pieces of the puzzle who continue with their work because it's part of their program, and then who basically return back to Building Bridges to show interim results. What we do now as a foundation, we do capture, of course, of the different action events. We also capture the outcomes and we say, okay, where are in fact initiatives where we can do our convening platform throughout the year, also help that continuation. That won't be on everything because of obviously the spectrum is very wide, but we are picking certain themes where our community tells us, in fact, we are listening. We talked about listening. We're listening to where we can help with our continuous platform for people to work throughout the year to assemble in smaller scale, not necessarily events, but also in small workshops or hackathon, to say we need to continue work. We need 3-4 touch points throughout the year so we can continue that collaboration. And we are the platform then to enable that.
How do you balance responsiveness to current issues with long-term vision?
Because we have different elements in the program, I think that helps us striking a good balance. So the long-term vision is something that is created through the ongoing work of the organizations. They basically have their North Star, what they are working on. And that is a long-term development. Of course, you then have immediate pressures that will not take you completely off track, but they will put a different angle on it. I'll give you one example. This year, the motto of the conference this year is Innovative Solutions and Investment Opportunities in Sustainable Finance. Remember, our mission, our goal is to move private investments towards sustainable finance. This year, you see a lot of backlash on environment, on sustainability in a moral sense, in a way. You have people denying it, people who say we have other priorities. So what is important to keep private investment moving into sustainability is to show that there are complete investment opportunities that will solve the issues, but they also will make money for investors. So how do we showcase that? In a way, it's back to business. But what is interesting is that there is an economic logic on why you would want to invest in climate, why you would want to invest in nature. And showcasing that, really surfacing that, is something that is, in a way, a reaction. You can say it's short-term, but it is something that has been triggered by some of the backlash, but it's also a healthy reminder to say, this is how you take people along. And it's not short-termism, but it's reacting to immediate pressures to say, how do we adapt the format so we know this is how we think will be most effective, and keeping the long-term trajectory, which is we are going to fund the SDGs long-term. We want to achieve those goals. How we keep that, but by maneuvering a little bit how we shape the program this year.
Large-scale convenings often appear seamless from the outside, but behind the scenes, they require navigating political tensions, competing agendas, and the inertia of institutions. For something like building bridges to remain agile and relevant, there must be difficult trade-offs and persistent effort. What are some of the biggest behind-the-scenes challenges in sustaining building bridges?
Well, one challenge is, of course, you're talking very different stakeholders who look at the goals differently. If you speak with financial investors, there's pressure from investors, there's pressure from politics. How can you continue sending a message that you're investing in sustainability, which is in fact not very well seen by the market sometimes because you have political tensions? So how do we cater to that world while making sure that the civil society, let's say, and NGOs don't say, oh no, but you're going off target? That is certainly a tension that is happening. Let's say if you're bringing multi-stakeholders together, you can't be a purist play. It's very easy to be an activist. And I'm not saying it's not easy to be an activist, but if I say there's a pure play thing to say, we know climate change is happening. We know we need to bring CO2 down. We are not fast enough. Somebody is to blame. That makes it easy, right? If you look at things black and white and put people into boxes, that's an easy way to do it. Same as the financial industry could also go out and say, you're dreamers. You don't know the reality of the business. That's the typical excuses you find on both sides, right? As soon as you start building bridges, it becomes a bit more gray because you need, it can't be the purest 100% on this side or the purest 100% on that side. And that is, of course, the tension you will always have when you bring different people together, because you think you're right, the other side is they are right. And where do you find that middle playing field to say, yes, in fact, we need to make a bit more time, but on the other hand, we can't be too lenient. And you need to make sure you are not just taking the leaders with you, but you also need to take the second tier and the third tier and the laggards with you. So how do you keep moving and nudging everybody along the path? And they will go at different speeds. And I think that's the tension that is sometimes hard to explain to the outside. To say, if I cater to the leader, they know what they do. They are completely 100% on it already. But I have others who are not. So but we want to take them along. We need to see how we inspire them. And that takes time and patience. And I think that is a big tension that's always happening. And I think that's obviously something you can't take away if you talk with very different people who have very different socialization.
I suppose one of the biggest challenges is to manage the complexity of expectations from public, private, and civil society actors. So how do you do that?
We include these groups in the decision making. We make them part of the creation of the program. The one thing I didn't mention, but we have these co-created events, the action events. We have a jury who decides on them. So one tension is we have only limited space. You can't grow a conference beyond a certain size. You can't do more than 3 days because then people just don't want to stay for longer, which means we have a limited space. And we had, again, 150 applications for action events. We could take 40. How do you select them? They're very strong. They all have their own justification. So we have an action event jury that comes from these different stakeholders groups. And they are the ones, in fact, who are taking the decision. So in a way, we're democratizing. It's not us, me, deciding. It's not the board. We're democratizing the decision-making there. And then some people might be in this year, some people not. As much as possible, we try to be inclusive. We're going to bring other people in. The tension, you will never fully deflect it, and tension is also healthy, but we always try to also match different parties with each other where they think they should be talking to each other, they have the same goal. And that's also, as soon as you get people talking to each other and having that open-minded, that at least how you can deflect some of the tension. And we try to have transparent process as much as possible by having that inclusivity. And I think that helps us really mobilize in community. So even those who didn't make it, they're invited to come, they can put themselves up as speakers. So they are not kind of out of the picture and there's no space for them. And I think that's a way, and at least how we try to deflect it.
What lessons have you learned about convening across sectors that others might benefit from?
You need to have, I would say, certain rules of engagement in a way. I think it's really important not to take side in the sense of somebody's right or wrong. I think it's important to keep the North Star. So remind people to say, what do we want to achieve with this? Why are we doing this? Why are we meeting? We want to do this because we want to move investments into sustainability. And if that is the North Star, other things will fall in place. And to recognize that, to achieve that, there are different ways on how to get there. And to say, it doesn't really matter how I get there, as long as they're different, there's no right or wrong way, probably. There are different ways in how you could tackle that problem. As long as we can agree then by keeping their North Star mind on how we can get there and what is right for that or the other player, as long as we have that in mind, that creates, I think, an openness and a respect for each other that will help achieve that goal and reduce some tension. The other thing I just mentioned is respect, not judging a different opinion or a different way as wrong or right, but saying there are different ways and recognizing that different people, different stakeholders have a different role to play. And recognizing that role to play and the framework is a first step in understanding what they can do and what they cannot do, rather than saying you're right or wrong because I have the right framework, you have the wrong framework. I think that judgment is something that's really, really important. And basically, it does prevent solution finding if people basically judge the other side by right or wrong, because that's not how you're going to find a joint solution.
Building bridges emerged from a need to move beyond fragmented efforts and toward collective long-term alignment between finance and global priorities. But the world is changing quickly and often unpredictably. When you look to the future, not just of the initiative, but of the broader world it seeks to shape, what is the change that most urgently needs to happen, and how can building bridges help bring that about?
I don't know if there's one change that urgently needs to happen. I think one thing that one thing that is happening, which is interesting, is that you would say probably multilateralism. The success will be in a lot of people, a lot of countries doing the right things in their way, which will lead to the goal. That sounds a little bit esoteric, maybe. But what I want to say is, at the moment, there's this whole idea that, the US is kind of concerned. Basically they are stepping back. Suddenly the European Union says, maybe we should reduce. you have other people stepping up. There's a huge movement in Asia on sustainable finance. There's a whole development there. Colombia, Brazil, and Africa, you have a lot of countries who are now engaging on how to regulate the carbon markets, how to come to agreements on reducing carbon, and so on. And I think what needs to change is, or what is changing, is that it's a broad, not just consensus, but it's a broad movement. And it's not spearheaded by one or two who say this is right or wrong, this is the way we need to do, but different organizations in different countries will find their way on how to tackle things. And having that shift and that, let's say, that broad movement is really, really important. And that shift is interestingly enough happening, and other countries are taking a lead. And suddenly, to some extent, Europe and the US is certainly a little bit on the back seat. And I think that's a recognition and a good reminder that everybody needs to pull in that same direction. And I find it an interesting shift because it's quite pronounced. And after the first 3 initial months of this year of shock, I would say, it's a positive movement to say, well, in fact, others are taking the bait and are totally staying on course. So I think that is important. What needs to happen urgently is putting clear incentives on how to invest in nature, how to invest in climate, and putting a value on that. The financial system needs to be incentivized to invest in those solutions. And the financial system, we're not going to change the financial system per se, in my view, but what needs to change is to make these investable. And you do that by putting, like a carbon credit, you put a value on reducing carbon. Then there's talk about nature credit. How do you put a value on those externalities so it really becomes an investable asset? And that is something that is already happening, but I think that needs to be really accelerated, because creating those incentives would mobilize and accelerate very quickly the move of capital into the right direction. And I think that is something that's a regulatory issue where countries have to agree. That agreement is not necessarily happening. So I think that is something where the world should get their act together more quickly to keep moving in that direction.
It's probably a limiting perspective, but for some, building bridges is an annual event, and for others, it's the early stage of a broader movement around sustainable finance and systems transformation. The difference between those two interpretations is important. Do you see building bridges evolving into something more than a convening, perhaps a movement or architecture for long-term collaboration? And if so, what would it look like?
Convening a movement for long-term systemic change, yes. But I think what's really important is to say you need a convening place in a way to do that. What is not helping is to create another initiative that replicates what others are already doing. So I think as building bridges, we need to be, we need to work with our community to leverage what they have and to really bring the right people together, much more than ourselves saying this is another initiative that kind of is doing something similar that somebody else is already doing. And I think it's more helping to consolidate and and bring those initiatives together and take some of the competition out of it. That is what we are trying to do, what we in fact are doing at the moment already, even if it doesn't always look like, it's not always as outward looking as a conference, which is very visible, but in the background, we're talking to a lot of different initiatives to see where we can make sure they work more together. And we can provide the neutrality because we don't run our own programs. We are not competing with them, but basically we can provide that space to collaborate even between similarly minded initiatives, will also convene, different parties move in the same direction. I think that movement is happening. It's using our community, and we are reacting to the demand of our community to say, where do they want to be connected? Where do they see a need for us to provide that safe space to have those conversations?
That's where we'll pause the first part of our conversation. In the second half, we'll move from Karen's personal journey and the origins of building bridges to its global positioning and future, how it navigates governance, power, technology, and inclusion to remain a catalyst for long-term systems change. I hope you'll join us for the second part of this episode.